Welcome to the Naval News segment. Today's news comes at us from the WarZone. The story, written by Mr. Thomas Nudik, states, Russian orders snap drills of its eastern units as negotiations over Ukraine disintegrate. Russian maneuvers which stress long-range deployments come as Ukraine reels from the effect of a major cyber attack. So we're going to begin by looking at what the cyber attack was. I have the screen right here. This message is being broadcast over many computers at the time of this recording all across Ukraine. And it says something to the effect of Ukrainians, exclamation point, all information about you has been released. Be afraid, expect the worst. It's a very adolescent, elementary playground worded threat that sounds ridiculous. But maybe some of that's lost in the translation. I don't know. But basically, there's a cyber attack going on in Ukraine right now as Russia conducts additional military exercises in the Far East. That's on the China side of Russia. But the exercise is long-range deployments. And the only direction those units can go from where they're normally stationed is westward towards Ukraine. So a lot of expectation is that some of these maneuvers may be related to this attack, and Russia has a long history of doing stuff like this to Ukrainian networks. All right, knowing all that, let's read from the piece expertly written by Mr. Thomas Nudik. He says, the Russian military has launched a series of snap drills in the far east of the country, leading to speculation that additional forces could be being prepared to move west, closer to the border with Ukraine, where Moscow has been steadily massing troops and equipment as fears of potential invasion of the country grow. These military maneuvers in the far east of Russia come after talks between Russia and Western officials addressed the worsening security situation that ended in a stalemate. At the same time, large-scale cyber attack targeting Ukraine government websites has occurring. So according to him, it's just government websites, not civilian. There is one report that I read that a car insurance company's network was also hacked with the same message. So take that for what it's worth. The Russian Ministry of Defense today released footage of snap drills in the Eastern Military District, including armored vehicles and other military equipment being loaded onto trains as part of what is described as an inspection drill to practice deploying over long distances. Some formations and units are being transferred to unfamiliar training grounds at a considerable distance from their points of permanent deployment, which is in the east, so it's implied that they're all moving west, which is where this hotspot is in Russia. And there are some videos here that if you go to the WarZone, you can watch some of the military people, dressed in full gear, getting ready to deploy. It's a very interesting video, including this train full of armored vehicles transiting somewhere, presumably to the west, but we don't know that for sure. While the final destination of this equipment is unclear, there are concerns it may be transported closer to the frontier with Ukraine or otherwise. These elements being moved is a diversionary tactic to cover developments on the western border. Either way, it's related. It's either a diversion or it's a reinforcement. Take your pick. Here's a great slide that I shared with my Patreons over a month ago, and this shows what is the expected battle plan if executed by Russia. This is what they can do, including encircling Kiev, securing many provinces near Donetsk, which includes freshwater supply to the Crimean Peninsula and Sevastopol. So that would be a major accomplishment if they were able to capture and hold this area here. Kiev, politically, very important. And even according to this slide, there is a force moving towards Odessa. And we know that they have recently conducted amphibious drills in the Black Sea and Sea of Azov. So they've been practicing amphibious operations recently. There's even some, according to this slide, forces in Belarus. We know these forces are actually there and could be going into the Ukraine from the north as well. So obviously none of this has happened yet, but this is one expected option, one plan, if you will. But let's get back to the piece and talk about what's actually happening instead of fear-mongering over what could happen. As it stands, Russia and Ukraine have already engaged in conflict since 2014, when Moscow launched an operation to seize the Crimean Peninsula before deploying capabilities to support separatists in eastern Ukraine fighting in the government in Kiev. Some have posited that Russia has been using the latest troop movements in the region around Ukraine borders as a tool to try and guarantee NATO that Ukraine and Georgia will not be permitted to join in the alliance in the future, as well as possibly satisfying other demands. These include removal of troops and equipment from NATO member states in Eastern Europe, returning to 1997 levels. And we'll talk about 1997. That's a very important date in our relation with post-Soviet Union Russia. 1997 was a pivotal moment that we will visit today. Before a wave of NATO expansion in the region, Russia denies it has plans to attack Ukraine, but says it could take unspecified military action unless demands are not met. All right, so let's talk about what Russia was negotiating with NATO and American leaders this week. Throughout, however, the Ukraine issue has been paramount throughout the discussions, with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stating, "We categorically will not accept the appearance of NATO right on our borders, especially so given the current course of the Ukrainian leadership." The issue and others has been discussed in the joint security discussions between Russia and the West that ended yesterday at the time of this writing. It's 2 days ago now for the time of this recording. Previously, Lavrov said that a failure of these talks could lead to Russia taking measures to deploy military hardware. When taking decisions with military hardware, we understand what we mean and what we are prepared for. So they refuse to explicitly say invade Ukraine. They often deny that they're going to invade Ukraine again after they did in 2014. But then they say, well, we could deploy this military hardware. Where might that be? Well, it certainly isn't China. So it's, everyone's looking at Ukraine right now. It's very obvious. So I think we have 2 bullet points that he covered. He says, Russia was not ready to wait forever for the United States and NATO to respond for our security demands. In other words, there's a deadline, and if you don't meet our demands by the deadline, then we'll move military hardware, which they've already begun doing, by the way. And Moscow has grounds to believe that U.S. NATO could start building up forces near Russia in the coming months, using tensions around Ukraine as a pretext. So other NATO nations, north of Ukraine, but still inside the NATO alliance, they could expect U.S. and NATO forces to build up there. Now, that is completely in the minds of the Russians. That's complete fiction. That is not happening. It's not going to happen. But this is the paranoia that seems to prevail, at least the political side of Russia right now. They are convinced that NATO and the United States want their territory. They want to invade. But I'm here to tell you, Russia's got nothing anybody wants. All we want is peace. And yet Russia is acting belligerently for just absolutely no reason. I equate this type of behavior to having a neighbor in your neighborhood, on your street, just a couple houses down, that you see out in his yard every day, yelling at you to stop making friends with my neighbors because they're my neighbors and not your neighbors. When in reality, we're all neighbors of each other, and the more friends we have, the better relationships that we have, that's better for all of us. So they can't point at Ukraine or Georgia or any other country and tell NATO what they can and cannot do in terms of building defensive alliances. So it wasn't me that agreed to that. It was Russia that agreed to that in 1997. And we're going to bring that up for you right here. Like I said, 1997 was a very important year for us. This is the year that they signed. Russia signed the NATO-Russia Founding Act. It was on May 14th of 1997. This press release was released the very next day, and it outlines exactly what the agreement is, including both sides conducting their military drills and informing each other when things like that are going to happen, so there's no misunderstanding. It was a very solid agreement. And the most important part of this agreement is this bit right at the very bottom here, and I'll read it for you if it's too small for you to read, but I'll put this link in the description so you can read it yourself. The act, referring to the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997, has no impact on NATO enlargement. That process is proceeding on schedule. NATO leaders at Madrid summit in July will extend invitations to the first countries and begin accession talks. These countries admitted will have full rights and responsibilities to the alliance membership, and the door of the membership will remain open to all emerging European democracies. So other countries in Europe need to meet certain requirements, like being democratically elected governments. They have to have a certain amount of their GDP towards their military so they can actually contribute to the shared defense of Europe. And there's other political wickets that they have to meet before they're allowed entry into NATO. And there's different levels of membership too. Not everyone's a full member of NATO, even after they meet these requirements. But the big thing is Russia agreed in 1997 that the relationship between NATO and Russia would not affect the open door policy that NATO has always had after 1997 towards allowing other members into NATO. They signed this. They agreed to this. This gentleman knows this, and he's just not happy about it. And they're acting in a very paranoid fashion, as if somebody wants something from Russia. Let me tell you something. In 1993, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was someone in charge of Russia called Yeltsin, Boris Yeltsin. He was quite the character. Look him up. He asked to become part of NATO. And NATO was like, no, we don't want Russia in NATO. Now, whether you agree with that decision or not, you can tell that Russia brings nothing to the table. There's nothing Russia has that anybody wants. Yet they go around the neighborhood acting as if they're being attacked or, some sort of attack is about to come. Extreme paranoia with no evidence. Nobody's threatening Russia. NATO is purely a defensive alliance. And I'll let the Secretary of State, the Deputy Secretary of State, say this better than I can. Listen to this. He's going to talk about how NATO adds members and versus what Russia does with things like annexing other nations.
Together, the United States and our NATO allies made clear we will not slam the door shut on NATO's open door policy, a policy that has always been central to the NATO alliance. As a defensive alliance, solely NATO is a defensive alliance. NATO exists to protect its member states. NATO has never expanded through force or coercion or subversion.
Force, coercion, and subversion is exactly the method of operation for Russia. That's exactly how they got Crimea, were through those three factors. And that's not the only place that they've done that. Yet Russia acts as if someone is ready to invade their mainland, their motherland, their borders. And nobody wants anything to do with Russia. Yet Russia is acting crazy right now in terms of paranoia. And they post things like this: Ukraine is 99%, Russian by, culture and heritage. That's all fine. If Ukraine is that much a part of Russia, maybe that they should get together and collectively talk to you or talk to Russia about joining and becoming, joined with Russia. That's a path open to them, yet they're not taking it, are they? I wonder why that is. Perhaps your numbers are a little incorrect, sir. Take a look at that. Now let's get back to the piece here. According to Russia, Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov, the Russian military specialists have been providing President Vladimir Putin with options in case the Ukraine situation worsens. However, he would not confirm or deny rumors that Moscow may deploy military assets to Cuba and Venezuela as a counterweight to NATO's continued presence. Now, the reason why that would be a little bit not a fair comparison is Cuba is not in any kind of alliance with Russia, and neither is Venezuela in terms of defense. They do have economic agreements and things like that, but they're not part of any kind of defensive network between each other. Anyway, so great piece written by Thomas. I encourage everyone to go over to the WarZone right now and read the rest of this. And just know that Russia is acting completely within its character, to be honest with you. They've always been paranoid since the end of the Cold War. The 90s were a terrible time for them, very embarrassing politically and culturally, because they were getting themselves back up off the ground after, the collapse of the Soviet Union and being broke, and corruption was rife in the 1990s. to credit Vladimir Putin. He put a stop to all that, or a lot of that, changed the corruption from, criminal organizations to political organizations. It's a little bit better, I guess. Very similar to what we have here in the United States anyway. Anyway, I look forward to your comments. I know this is a highly politicized topic. Let yourself go, man. Put it in the comments and I'll take a look at it and I'll respond to a lot of them. Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you next time.